Mr. President, when the story of the 21st century is written, there'll be a couple chapters about Vladimir Putin's Russia and most certainly chapters about radical jihadists, and perhaps a few chapters on some other things that we have yet to fully anticipate. There still remains over 80 years in the century. But there is no doubt that the vast majority of the story about the 21st century will be about the relationship between the United States and China. China, the most populous nation on earth, the second largest economy, soon to be the largest economy on the planet, is a country that cannot be contained. It will be a major factor both economically and geopolitically, as it should be for a nation of that magnitude and of a culture that deep with such long history. However, there are imbalances developing in that relationship which I believe are threatening not just to our nation, but ultimately to the peace, the security, and the stability of the world. And it is on that topic that I wanted to come to the floor and speak today, and perhaps about some of the things we need to know about it. There was a consensus, which I would admit, I perhaps from time to time was a partaker in, that China was a country that would eventually, as it grew more prosperous, would become not just more democratic, but more willing to live by the rules that the world has conducted itself by since the end of the Second World War. Now, perhaps I wasn't as strong an adherent of that as some others. I've always been, of course, deeply suspicious of communism and autocratic nations. But there was still the belief that somehow things could work out and that eventually, at some point, both demographics and economics would force China to accept the benefits and the wisdom of a global economic order that has maintained the peace since the end of the Second World War. That was a terrible mistake. For in fact, that is not how it has played out. For the better part of 30 years now, China has been allowed to systematically violate all of the rules of fair play in trade and commerce, under the guise of saying eventually they're going to come around and behave. Not only has it not worked, it has allowed them to accelerate their economic growth to the detriment of American workers, American industry, and economies all over the world. Today, China is 3 years into a plan called Made in China 2025. And what Made in China means, and what it's all about is, China intends to be the dominant power and dominate 10 key sectors of the future economy. They outline what all 10 of those are. Now, if that dominance was the result of being more innovative or spending more money on research or just being better, then we would have little to complain about. It would be on us to become even more innovative ourselves and to put more money into research and technology and these sorts of things. But that's not what it's the product of. It's the product of cheating. The massive theft of intellectual property, the largest single transfer of wealth in the history of mankind, stolen. Stolen because they buy small companies who are developing some key component in a broader technology, and they take it for themselves. Stolen because when an American company, or any foreign company for that matter, wants to do business in China and have access to their 1.3 and 1.4 billion people, you have to partner. They make you partner with a Chinese company. Your partner, quote unquote, steals your secrets, and then they kick you out, and now they're your competitor. So you think about it, they are able to make all of these advances without paying for them. Imagine if you had a business that was able to grow without having to pay for all the research that went to getting you to that point. This is what they do. And it has allowed them to expand militarily, commercially, economically, to a point where we are now at the edge of a very dangerous economic and geopolitical imbalance that needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed now. We're almost out of time. 5 years from now, 6 years from now, 3 years from now, it may be too late to address this. And I want to reiterate what I said at the outset. This is not about containing China, nor is it about crippling China. It is about ensuring that we are going to have stability in the world, a stability in which our companies and their companies can partner, but they need to do so voluntarily, a stability where they cannot steal our secrets, a stability where they cannot violate the rules of trade, but benefit from the rules of trade. And so that is what I hope to address through a new bill called the Fair Trade in China Enforcement Act, which I have filed today. The first problem we want to address is that China is building its industrial capacity with U.S. intellectual property and technology. I've highlighted how they steal our technology and our intellectual property, and they use it. As an example, General Electric and Honeywell technology is being used in China by one of GE and Honeywell's competitors. They didn't sell it to them. It was stolen from them. Two American companies had their secrets stolen, and now their competitor in China is using their technology that they spent money and time investing in. The solution to that problem is to pass a law that prohibits the sale of national security sensitive technology and intellectual property to China. And the bill would do this by directing the Department of Commerce to use its export control authority to block military capacity exports and components of Made in China 2025 exports to China. So basically, the Department of Commerce would look at Made in China 2025. These are the sectors that they're trying to dominate, and we would prohibit the sale or the transfer of intellectual property sensitive to those industries. Meaning, American companies, even if they have a partnership with China, would be prohibited by law in sharing this information with them willingly. The second problem we have, frankly, is here at home. And that is we have these large multinational United States companies that have very valuable intellectual property and technology who partner with Chinese firms, and they know that their intellectual property is going to be stolen, but they don't care. And they don't care, number one, because they're not going to pay the full cost of the loss of this intellectual property. It's going to be borne out by the entire country. A great example of that would be a CEO or a business executive. They know they're only going to be at the company for X number of years, and so they make the decision that I don't care if they're going to steal our intellectual property. I want to have access to the Chinese market because it's 1.4 billion people. It's going to allow us to sell a bunch of stuff there. Our profits are going to go up. I'm going to look good in the quarterly reports. I'm going to look good before the board of directors. And who cares if this harms the United States? My obligations is to the corporation, not the country. That's their view. In fact, many of these CEOs of large multinational companies, they consider themselves to be citizens of the world before they consider themselves to be citizens of the United States. They are willing to turn these things over because by the time we are hurt by it as a nation, they're long gone. By the time they're hurt by it as a company, they're long gone. But they're going to have some pretty good quarters as they expand into the largest market in the world, and their shareholders and their board of directors are going to be very happy about it. That's a big problem. Just because a company has their address in the United States does not mean that they consider themselves to be American companies. And of course, this is a big, big problem among many large multinational corporations who are doing business there and know exactly what's going on, but are more interested in the short-term profits than in the impact on our national security. The solution that I propose to that problem in this law is to increase taxes on multinational corporations and the income that they earn in China, and the tax would be increased equal to the amount of the lost value of the stolen intellectual property or technology. So if we've lost $1 billion, there'd be $1 billion increase in that business profit that they made in China through that partnership. It does this by imposing a tax rate of 2%, roughly equal to what the Trade Representative's Office estimates is the cost of lost intellectual property as a percent of total corporate profits in China. The third problem we have is that China, and I mean China, both its sovereign wealth management and individuals that have made a lot of money, directed by government in many cases, has gone on a buying spree of U.S. debt, meaning treasuries, of stocks, even of real estate. My hometown of Miami is one of the places that's being heavily invested in now to increase their trade surplus and to weaken the U.S. economy. You say how? Let me give you an example. After China rose to the World Trade Organization, it had all this excess capital resulting from its large surpluses. And so what that drove them to do is to take that excess capital they were making now that they were a part of the WTO and investing it in the United States in real estate, for example. So here you have people coming in and paying for real estate above the value of the property, driving up prices. It's one of the things that helped fuel the housing bubble. You can only imagine if the property next door, the building next door, the luxury condominium units next door are sold at a price higher than what the asking price might be, you're driving up the market for everybody. But they do this over and over again, this cheap financing of our debt, buying up so many of our treasuries because there's such demand for that Treasury notes, because there's so much demand for our debt, our yield, the amount of interest that we pay back to the investor, is lower. And the result is it's one of the things that's driven our national debt here. It's been so easy to borrow because it's been cheap. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is to update the income tax treaty that was signed in the 1990s, and that taxes profits on China on these investments, including their holdings of the national debt, at a preferential rate to what it would be for anybody else. And what my law would do is it would make withholding taxes on Chinese investment income revert to what the law is for everyone else. For example, the U.S. payer would withhold a greater amount of tax on distributions to Chinese payees. So they would now have whatever income they are making from the debt, from the stocks, from the assets they've bought in the United States and they've invested in, whatever they're making on it, they would pay taxes on that income the same as anybody else would, as opposed to under a preferential rate in the 1980s. And this is important, because among the things that all of this investment, surplus investment, does in the U.S. is it increases the value of the dollar artificially. They did that when they were manipulating currency. And the stronger the dollar, the weaker our exports, the more expensive it is to buy something the United States is selling. Now, the currencies fluctuate as a matter of course through economic engagement, but this is the deliberate manipulation of our currency. This is one of the byproducts of this. Taxing the income they make on those investments the same as anybody else would have to pay, and not this preferential rate, would help bring some balance to that. One additional problem that we want to address is that the Chinese government's Made in 2025 plan is a plan to displace advanced American manufacturing, and they intend to do that no matter what it takes. Let me give you an example. Made in China 2025 targets artificial intelligence and next-generation information technology. They target robotics. They target new energy vehicles. They target biotechnology, meaning biopharma, biologics in terms of curing diseases. They target energy and power generation. They target aerospace, which is not just airplanes, but space travel. They target high-tech shipping, targeting advanced railway, new materials, agricultural machinery. These advanced high-tech industries are supposed to be the competitive advantage of the United States in the 21st century. This is not protectionism, what I'm talking about. If this was a fair competition on these technologies versus them, that's what free markets are supposed to do. But that's not how they're doing it. The way they compete with us in these industries is, in addition to stealing our secrets and buying up the companies that are in the supply chain, they deny our companies access to their markets, but they want full and unfettered access to ours. What is the solution? The solution is to prepare duties on and impose Chinese investor shareholding caps on U.S. companies producing goods targeted by Made in China 2025. This bill would do this by defining Made in China 2025 as a countervailable subsidy for American industries affected by Made in China 2025 exports, thus reducing future demand for Chinese exports in these industries. We have to raise the price of the products that they are stealing from us, otherwise they will put our industries out of business. And our children will live in a world where we depend on China for artificial intelligence, for robotics, for new energy vehicles, for aerospace, for pharma. Can you imagine living in a world where the cure to Alzheimer's is controlled by Chinese pharmaceutical companies? The amount of leverage that it would give them geopolitically. And if they reach that plateau because they out-hustled us, that's one thing. But to get there by stealing what we produce, by denying our companies' ability to sell over there, but asking us to allow their companies to sell here, that's not competition. That's theft. That's an imbalance. That needs to be addressed. By the way, we also have the SEC block any majority stake acquisition of a listed company producing the component goods in any of these industries in the Made in China 2025 exports. And this is in order to limit their ability to buy up our small companies or buy up enough of a controlling interest in American companies to take them from us. That's the other strategy they have, is they go into industries that go under the threshold of what the government looks into, and they buy up percentages of the company or the entire company themselves, and now they control what was supposedly an American company. They now own it. Try doing that in China if you're an American. And the argument that we should continue to allow them to do it because they're a developing country is ridiculous. No one can make that argument anymore. But that's the argument that's been made for all these years. There is one last thing that we need to do, and there's been in the news a lot lately. The Chinese around the world and have tried in the United States to use their companies in telecommunications, particularly Huawei and ZTE, to infiltrate U.S. networks. And how that works basically is they wanted us to buy components and parts and equipment from Huawei and use it for our cell phone networks, our internet networks, our servers and routers, put those in our country. Well, if you're someone and you're a country who, as a matter of geopolitical strategy, steal, not just spy like normal countries do, but steal intellectual property and corporate secrets to build your economy at the expense of someone else's, and you control the routers and the telecom system or enough of it in another country, we're just making it easier for you to steal these things from us. Imagine a major U.S. university conducting research, and their entire back office and all of their computer networks on which this is stored has Huawei equipment. It allows the Chinese government to go into this equipment, remotely use it to extract all of this information. They don't even have to send any spies over here because we've brought them inside. This is a problem across the economy, and that needs to be dealt with in broader terms. But in this bill, a bill that I have separately also filed with Senator Cotton, we would prohibit the federal government or subsidiaries and contractors of the federal government from buying telecommunication equipment or services from Huawei or ZTE. Because what we cannot afford is to have in our own government or in companies that are servicing the government telecommunications equipment and services vulnerable to espionage, either corporate or national security. Let me close with this. There are a lot of big issues going on in the world. And for a lot of people, including myself, this issue is pretty new. I've long been concerned about China's military expansion. They're putting all kinds of missiles now on these islands in the South China Sea. I most certainly have long been concerned about their human rights violations, what they've done with Tibet, the way they're bullying people on Taiwan. By the way, just so you know the sort of influence level they have, Marriott Corporation fired an American worker, an American living in the United States, working for Marriott, was fired because they liked a social media post about Tibet. And so the Chinese got mad. They told Marriott, you need to correct this, and they fired the employee, an American, because he liked a social media post by mistake about Tibet. Did you know United Airlines and American Airlines just got a letter from the Chinese government saying that unless you change your website so that it says Taiwan, China, and not just Taiwan, we're going to start fining you and may take away your ability to fly into China? American companies, which I hope do not give in. This is happening every single day. Do you know that Hollywood movies are made so that they would be allowed to be distributed in China? In essence, Hollywood and entertainment is deliberately not making movies or saying certain things in movies. Political things, things that would offend the Chinese government, because if you do, they won't let you sell your movie to 1.3, 1.4 billion people. Do you know that there are actors, like Richard Gere, for example, who can't make major movies anymore because they can't be distributed in China, because he's in favor of Tibet and its independence? These are happening. And we're arguing about a bunch of other silly things. This is historic. This is the single biggest challenge facing this nation for the next 20, 30, or 40 years, and we are almost out of time to take it seriously. Just a week ago, I traveled to Latin America. I was in Panama, where the Chinese have built not one but two port facilities on the Panama Canal. Not surprisingly, because of all this investment, last year Panama decided to switch. It no longer recognizes Taiwan, it switched to China. Last week, while I was in Panama, the Dominican Republic announced they had switched. Little by little, they are going and using their investments in these countries, first to get them to de-recognize Taiwan, but ultimately, because they're spending so much money in these countries, to leverage them to align their foreign policy to China's in our own hemisphere. We do not want conflict with China. We want parity, stability, reciprocity, and fairness. That's not what we have right now. and we've taken far too long to take it seriously. Now is the time to do it. This is about more than just trade. This is about geopolitics and national security. It will be the defining issue of the century, and the time to take it seriously is now. And my bill, which we hope to continue to build on and improve, is our effort to hopefully begin this dialogue and taking steps on this very important topic.